Well, it is my delight to see each and every one of you this morning and to welcome those of you who are visiting with us, and to invite you to come back and be with us again as you have the opportunity. Last Sunday morning, I presented what I called the biblical case against abortion. And I want to quickly remind you of the major points in that study before we continue our study of this particular Bible subject. This is a cumulative case, and these are just the bare bones. We spent all of our time last Sunday putting some meat on these bones, but let me remind you of what we said last week. First of all, there is life in a mother's womb before birth. May I remind you that when Mary went to visit her kinsman Elizabeth, that the babe in Elizabeth's womb leaped in her womb. The Bible teaches that this life is human. Since animals and men reproduce after their kind, it can only be human life that is in a mother's womb before birth. And I reminded you that human life is made in the image of God. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And James tells us in James 3 and verse 9 that what was true of Adam and Eve in the very beginning is true of every human being since then. We are all made in the image of God. And I argued that human life made in the image of God is in that image from conception. Genesis 1 tells us that God created Adam and Eve in His image and likeness, and Genesis 5 tells us that Adam's son Seth was begotten in his own likeness and image. Same language used in both passages. Well, if Adam was created in the image and likeness of God, and Seth was begotten in the likeness and image of his father Adam, then it certainly seems to me that Seth was begotten in the image and likeness of God from conception. And because human life made in the image of God, or because that is the fact, innocent human life must not be killed. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, God told Noah, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." And therefore, all of that brings me to this conclusion: since abortion is the taking of innocent human life made in the image of God, abortion is morally wrong. Now, I stated last week that I know that I'm preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to believers. I'm preaching to people who already believe that abortion is morally wrong. And yet we need to understand what the biblical case against abortion is. I know that unbelievers will not be persuaded by the case that I presented last week, but I'm not preaching primarily to unbelievers. I'm talking to you, trying to equip you and inform you so that you'll truly understand what the Bible teaches about this important subject. This morning, I want to continue our study by looking at a wide variety of arguments made in favor of abortion. Now, most of these arguments are made by unbelievers, and yet I think we need to be familiar with their arguments and equip ourselves to respond to them as we have the opportunity to do that. And so pro-abortionists tell us that a woman should have the right to choose what she wants to do with her own body. And I would say, first of all, that the real issue is not a woman's right to choose. In almost every case, the woman had the choice to have sex or to get pregnant. Those who make this argument do not want the right to choose. They want the right to avoid the responsibility or the consequences of their choice. We need to understand that certain acts automatically carry with them certain responsibilities. We may avoid the responsibility by choosing not to participate in the act to begin with, but we are not free to participate in the act and then try to avoid its inherent responsibilities. Maybe I can illustrate the point this way. I may choose not to drive an automobile and therefore avoid the consequences that come sometimes when you drive. But having chosen to drive, I must accept the inherent responsibilities of that choice. To say that a woman has a right to choose not to be pregnant even after she's voluntarily chosen to participate in the very act that made her pregnant is the height of hypocrisy. But then in the second place, may I say to you that the real issue is not the woman's body, but the body of the baby inside her. The single-celled fertilized ovum or the later developing embryo within the woman's womb cannot by any stretch of the imagination be considered part of her body. This new living being has a genetic code that is totally different from the cells in her mother's body. So in abortion, we're not just talking about the mother's body, we are talking about the body of her unborn child. And then in the third place, I would say in response to this argument, no one has the right to do whatever he wants to do with his own body. The Bible teaches that we are the offspring of God and that God has authority over our bodies. All men belong to God by creation. And Christians belong to God in a double sense by redemption. And we have the obligation to present our bodies as living sacrifices to be used in God's service. I would just simply ask this question: does anybody have the right to use his body to commit murder, rape, incest, pedophilia, or suicide? We understand that no one has the right to do everything that he might want to do with his own body. Well, we are told in the second place that a woman should have the right to privacy. Well, I would simply ask, does a child pornographer, a rapist, a murderer have the right to privacy? If you were standing outside your neighbor's door and you could hear your neighbor battering her child, even to the point of death, would you respect her right to privacy? No, you're going to break down the door and rescue the child, because by the assault on that child, she surrendered her right to privacy. In the case of abortion, the right of the child to live is greater than, and it supersedes any right that a woman might have to the privacy of her own body. We are told that abortion is merely a form of birth control. We must realize that there is a big difference between preventing conception and killing the living product of conception. Most forms of birth control, not all, but most, prevent conception. In contrast to that, abortion kills the human life that has been conceived. Oh, it's true that in one sense, abortion is a form of birth control, but in the same way that killing a pregnant woman would be a form of birth control. One so-called expert argued that abortion is self-defense. That argument was made by Eileen McDonough, a political science professor, in her book entitled Breaking Abortion Deadlock from Choice to Consent. Listen to what she says. Even in a medically normal pregnancy, the fetus massively intrudes on a woman's body and expropriates her liberty. If the woman does not consent to this transformation and use of her body, the fetus's imposition constitutes injury sufficient to justify the use of deadly force to stop it. Can you believe that? Do you find that astounding and amazing that someone would utter words like that? The fatal flaw in this, quote, justifiable homicide argument is the issue of consent. Professor McDonough must at least concede that any time a woman consents to sexual relations and conceives, the unborn baby is an invited guest, not a liberty-stealing burglar. Well, we are told that aborting a baby is better than bringing it into a home where it is unwanted. Planned Parenthood tells us that every child has the right to be loved and wanted. And they're right about that. But they're dead wrong when they say that the solution is to give the mother the right to kill her unwanted and unloved child. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a world where there were no unwanted wives, aged parents, Jews, blacks, Catholics, Hispanics, etc.? But shall we remedy this terrible solution by taking their lives as well? May I remind you that Hitler tried that in Nazi Germany. Since when does anyone's right to live depend upon somebody else wanting them? I think John Wilkie was correct when he said the pivotal question is, should any civilized nation give to one citizen the absolute right to kill another to solve that first person's personal problem? The fact that a person creates an inconvenience or an unwanted responsibility for us no more justifies us killing him before he's born than it does after he's born. If we can kill the unwanted unborn, can we kill the unwanted newborn or teenager or elderly? This argument assumes that unwanted pregnancies will result in unwanted children, but this is not necessarily so. Ladies, think of your pregnancies. Was each one planned? Were you really happy each time you got pregnant? But now you're glad you have them. Would you give any of them back? Wilkie observes, if we permit abortion for an unwanted pregnancy, we will be destroying vast numbers of children who, by the time of their birth and through their childhood, would have been very dearly wanted and deeply loved children indeed. Brother John Clark spoke on this subject in the 1979 Florida College Lectures. And in that lecture, he uttered these words near his conclusion. He says, I must close now. But I suggest this to you when you're thinking about babies coming into the world, and I've had 5 of them. Now, you know, when we were expecting our 5th child, and in fact, when I learned about our 5th child, Ruth told me that some of the sisters of the congregation said, what are you going to do? She smiled and said, I'm going to New York. What do you think? What do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to give birth to this child and we're going to love it. At almost any time in stages of pregnancy, you could speak about the question of whether wanted or unwanted. But let me tell you something. When my little boy came, all of those questions about how are we going to pay for him, how are we going to survive, were wiped away in the sunshine of that new soul from God. This argument assumes that unwanted children have to stay with parents who do not want them, and this is just not so. Thousands of couples are waiting to adopt children that others do not want. It is a crying shame that adoption is so difficult and so expensive in our society today. But folks, the real problem, or the real solution, I should say, to the problem of unwanted children is to teach mothers and fathers to love them. Paul told Titus in Titus chapter 2, verse 3, the older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children. That's the solution to unwanted children. Well, we're told it's better to abort a child than to abuse one. Ladies and gentlemen, abortion is the worst form of child abuse. If it's permissible to kill a child before birth to prevent possible child abuse, would it be permissible to kill a child after birth to prevent actual child abuse? This argument assumes that aborting unwanted children will reduce child abuse, but the statistics tell us that child abuse has drastically increased in our society since abortion was legalized in this country in 1973. But then we're told abortion should be allowed when there will be little, if any, quality of life. A professor at the UCLA Medical School asked his students this question. Here is a family history. The father has syphilis, the mother has TB. They already have had 4 children. The first is blind, the second has died, the third is deaf, the fourth has TB, the mother is pregnant, the parents are willing to have an abortion if you decide they should. What do you think? Most of the students in his class decided on abortion. And the professor said, congratulations, you have just murdered Beethoven. A similar argument certainly could be made with the case of Joseph and Mary and our Lord Jesus Christ. This argument says in essence that the quality of life is more important than the sanctity of life. But the Bible argues exactly the opposite, that the sanctity of life is what is most important. God has not given anyone the right to decide that someone should not live because he is physically deformed, mentally retarded, or economically disadvantaged. And may I add that the quality of life argument is a slippery slope that raises many questions. First of all, just what are the minimum requirements for an acceptable quality of life? How poor does someone have to be? How mentally retarded is too mentally retarded? How physically handicapped is too physically handicapped? How dysfunctional must a family be to be too dysfunctional? And who has the power to make those decisions? How sure must we be that a poor quality of life in the beginning will continue throughout life? Many people who are born in poverty later overcome that economic disadvantage. And some of the greatest people in the history of the world were born into poverty. Should they have been aborted? And how do we know ahead of time that a poor quality of life will cause enough misery to justify killing? Are people automatically miserable just because they are poor, or physically handicapped, or mentally challenged? I think Beethoven and Helen Keller would argue with that conclusion. Many parents in our society today have found a handicapped child to be a wonderful blessing in their lives. And if a poor quality of life justifies aborting the unborn, does it justify killing the newborn? As unbelievable as that may sound, that is exactly what some are proposing. You may remember that it was James Watson and Francis Crick who were the discoverers of the DNA molecule. Listen to what James Watson says. If a child were not declared alive until 3 days after birth, then all parents could be allowed the choice. Only a few are given under the present system. The doctor could allow the child to die if the parents so choose and save a lot of misery and suffering. I believe this view is the only rational, compassionate attitude to have. Francis Crick said something similar. No newborn infant should be declared human until it has passed certain tests regarding its genetic endowment, and that if it fails these tests, it forfeits the right to live. Those are frightening statements. Those statements are reminiscent of the attitude in Nazi Germany in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. We are told that abortion should be permitted as long as the baby is not viable. Most people define viability as being capable of independent existence. But by this definition, a 7-pound newborn baby is not viable. A handicapped child at any age is not viable. The senile old person rendered incompetent by a stroke is not viable. And a completely psychotic individual is not viable. And the quadriplegic war veteran is not viable. And few of us are viable. You drop me off in the wilderness of Alaska, and I'm not going to last very long. Wilkie is right when he said viability is a measure of the sophistication of the life support systems around the baby. It does not measure the humanness or aliveness of the baby himself or herself. A baby in the womb and in the crib is dependent on others, but dependence is not proof that it isn't human. And then we're told, well, a fetus is just not a person. I like what Brother Clark said about that. Great Scott, Dred Scott all over again. In the 1857 Supreme Court decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney ruled that a black slave, Dred Scott, was not a human being with citizenship rights. Therefore, his master could do with him as he wished. Look at the parallels between slavery and abortion. In Dred Scott, it was a 7-2 decision, the same in Roe v. Wade. In the Dred Scott case, they argued that a black person was a non-person. In Roe v. Wade, it was argued that the unborn is a non-person. Dred Scott was the property of his owner. In Roe v. Wade, the child is the property of its owner, its mother. The owner of Dred Scott could choose to buy, sell, or kill. Under Roe v. Wade, it was said that the mother could decide to keep or kill. It was argued in the Dred Scott case that abortionists should not impose morality on slave owners. The same argument was made in Roe v. Wade. It was decided that slavery is legal. It was decided in Roe v. Wade that abortion is legal. We are told that abortions are going to be performed anyway, so they might as well be legal. Well, let me tell you, folks, that same argument could be made about legalizing rape, theft, incense, murder, and drug use. Legalizing abortion encourages some to obtain abortions who would not do so if it were not legal. This argument ignores the fact that some things are always wrong. And then we're told that abortion should be legal because of the danger of illegal abortions. The stories about thousands of women dying from illegal abortions have been exaggerated. Let me see if I can find that chart right there. You can see that there were several women who died from abortion prior to 1943, when penicillin was first widely available, but the number drops off dramatically. In 1940, there were 1,679 maternal deaths reported from abortion. In 1981, there were only 8. While some folks are so concerned for the women who would resort to unsanitary, back alley, illegal abortions, they are indifferent to over 63 million unborn babies who have been brutally poisoned, burned, and hacked to death in this country since 1973. But then someone says, but we have no right to legislate morality. Well, it's true that we can't make people believe certain things and hold certain values by acts of legislation. But folks, we can and we must legislate morality. By that I mean our civil laws should reflect correct principles of morality. God ordained civil government, according to the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, to protect the good and punish the evil. And to do that, it must legislate morality. Furthermore, we have always legislated morality. Laws against rape, incest, robbery, assault, murder are moral laws. Brother Mike Willis was correct when he said the issue is not whether or not morality can be legislated, but whose morality will be legislated. Shall the moral standards of humanism, atheism, and other non-Christian perspectives become the morals of our country, or will Christian ethics be legislated? We are told that abortion is permissible because the soul is not imparted until the child is born and takes his first breath. Genesis 2:7 talks about God forming Adam from the dust of the earth and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, and we're told, and man became a living soul. We need to understand that the Hebrew word nephesh, that is translated soul, means different things in different contexts. Sometimes it refers to that immortal part of man that is also called his spirit. Sometimes it refers to biological life that is possessed by both man and animals. This argument is based upon the assumption that the word soul in Genesis 2:7 refers to man's immortal spirit, not merely his biological life, and that is an assumption that must be proved. But even if that assumption is true, that does not prove that the soul is imparted when a baby takes its first breath outside the mother's womb, because this was a very special case of creation, and no other human being has ever come into existence in this way. The unique case of Adam, who was never a zygote or a fetus, can hardly be used to define the point at which a fetus becomes human. Adam had no life at all before God breathed into his nostrils, but life does exist for the fetus before it begins to breathe oxygen through its nostrils. A fetus takes oxygen through the placenta within several days of conception. And a fetus is actively breathing amniotic fluid into its lungs within the first trimester. Furthermore, Genesis 2 verse 7 refers to the unique creation of an adult. Can we logically argue that a person does not receive his spirit and is not a true human being until adulthood, since Adam received his spirit as an adult? I think you see the problem. This argument is comparing apples and oranges, and it just will not stand. Well, we are told that Exodus 21, verses 22 through 24, makes a clear distinction between the life of the mother and the life of the unborn child. Let's look at the passage. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Abortionists argue from this passage that since a miscarriage means the death of a fetus, and since only a fine was imposed as punishment, the fetus was not considered a human life because death was the punishment for taking human life. But folks, the contrast in this passage is not harm to the mother versus harm to the child. The contrast is no harm to mother or child versus harm to either mother or child. And if either the mother or the child is harmed, the punishment was to be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. We are told, since one is not a new creature, a babe in Christ, until he is born again, then one is not a human being until he is both conceived and born. Of course, John 3 is Jesus' discussion with Nicodemus concerning the new birth. But in that discussion, Jesus does not say that every part of a natural birth has its counterpart in the spiritual birth, or vice versa. It is a dangerous hermeneutic to take a scriptural analogy in which a spiritual application is drawn from a natural illustration, then turn it around and try to use it to prove something in the natural realm which was not expressed in the illustration. That was a mouthful, and if I restated it, I don't think it would help, so I'm not going to do that. We are told that abortion should be allowed when giving birth would be a threat to the mother's mental health. Well, experts in the field of psychiatry and psychology tell us that giving birth is usually not a threat to a mother's mental health. Dr. R. Sloan says, and by the way, he is a pro-abortionist, quote, "There are no unequivocal psychiatric indications for abortion." Frank Ide says, "True psychiatric reasons for abortion have become practically non-existent. Modern psychiatric therapy has made it possible to carry a mentally ill woman to term." Furthermore, having an abortion could be much more harmful to the mother's health than giving birth. Dr. Theodore Liddy says, and he was a professor of psychiatry at Yale University, "It is practically impossible to predict when an abortion will not be more detrimental to the mental health than the carrying of the child to birth." Should murder be allowed if a newborn threatens a mother's mental health? Well, we are told that abortions should be allowed in cases of rape and incest. First of all, relatively few children are conceived through rape. Rape and incest abortions account for only a fraction of 1% of the abortions performed. But if a raped woman conceives, the life within her is still an innocent human being. A child is not responsible for his father's sins, and it should not be punished for the sins of his father. Moses said in Deuteronomy 24:16, "Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin." The fact that a woman has been victimized by a rapist does not give her the right to victimize an unborn child. An abortion will not undo what has already been done, and two wrongs never make a right. But someone asks, is it fair for a rape victim to have to endure the trauma and the inconvenience of an unwanted pregnancy? The answer is no. But folks, life isn't always fair. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 9:11, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Unfortunately, innocent people sometimes suffer as a consequence of others' sins. We all understand that innocent people are often killed or maimed by drunken drivers. Mary Meehan observes, "What do we say about all of this? It seems to be that honesty requires us to say that it is unjust that a woman must carry to term a child conceived through rape. But it is a far greater injustice to kill the child. There is no way to avoid injustice in this situation. The best we can do is reduce it. The first injustice, which lasts for 9 months of a life, can be relieved both financially and psychologically, but the second injustice ends a life, and there is no remedy for that." I believe she is correct. Paul teaches that we are to overcome evil with good in Romans chapter 12. We are told that abortion should be allowed to protect the life of the mother. Again, folks, abortion in such cases are extremely rare. In fact, they are almost non-existent in today's sophisticated medical environment. C. Everett Koop, who was the U.S. Surgeon General under Ronald Reagan, if memory serves me correctly, he said, "Never once did a case come across my practice where abortion was necessary to save a mother's life." No more than 1% of abortions are performed for physical health reasons. If a mother's actual life is threatened, a conscientious doctor will try to save both mother and baby. But if this is not possible, the issue really boils down to this: will we save one, the mother, or will we allow both to die? A therapeutic abortion is comparable to rescuing one person from a burning building, even though you cannot rescue another. This is mercy, not murder, and it bears no relation to abortion on demand. But the rationale that will allow a therapeutic abortion will not allow non-therapeutic abortions. The questions are completely different. If two people were drowning and I could only save one, my difficult decision would not justify another in drowning someone. In a case where both mother and baby cannot be saved, the decision to save the mother certainly would not justify the intentional killing of other unborn babies. Quickly, what can we do? Well, we can be realistic about the problem. I must tell you that I never thought that I would live to see the day when Roe v. Wade would be overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. I am thankful that that has occurred, but that hasn't solved the abortion issue in our society. We all understand that. Not by a long shot. Someone has said that the pessimist is the person who sees the tunnel, and the optimist is the person who sees the light at the end of the tunnel, but the realist is the person who sees the tunnel and the light and the next tunnel too. The abortion problem has not been solved by the reversal of Roe v. Wade. Folks, we can pray. We can pray and we can keep on praying because James says the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. We can pray for those on the front lines fighting this battle. We can pray for politicians and preachers and doctors and pro-life leaders. We can pray for pregnant women who are contemplating abortion. We can pray for those who have had abortions. And we can get involved. We need to take personal responsibility. Saying, I must do something, gets a whole lot more done than saying something must be done. And we can get involved in many different ways. We can lift our voice in protest. We can financially support organizations that are fighting abortion. We can speak out against abortion in our everyday conversations with our friends and neighbors. We can be responsible parents who are informed about what is being taught and advocated in our children's classrooms. We can be responsible voters. We can write or call our elected representatives. We can volunteer our time, energy, and financial resources. We can open our hearts and our homes to unwed mothers, and if not our hearts and our homes, then our pocketbooks. We can participate in demonstrations in our own personal preference, of our own personal preference, that do not violate the laws of God or the laws of the land or the dictates of our conscience. We can seriously consider adoption. Edmund Burke once observed, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. We can strengthen our arguments. The famous man of letters Samuel Johnson observed a debate between a young preacher and someone else, and Johnson told the young preacher, lower your voice and strengthen your arguments. We need to strengthen our arguments and then raise our voice. We can practice what we preach about moral purity. The vast majority of abortions occur because people choose to live immorally and then they want to avoid the consequences. And so as Christians, we need to set the right example. The wise man says in Proverbs 28 verse 4, those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but such as keep the law contend with them. Folks, we can flee youthful lust and we can flee fornication. And as the comedian Flip Wilson used to say, the booth in the back in the corner in the dark is not the place to flee fornication. We can teach our children to love their children. The Bible teaches that children are a heritage from the Lord to be loved and valued and protected. The psalmist says in Psalm 127 verse 3 and following, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward, like arrows in the hand of a warrior. So are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. When the Apostle Paul indicted the Gentiles of sin in Romans chapter 1, in that catalog of sin was the sin of being without natural affection. And Paul said that those who are guilty of those kinds of sins are worthy of death. What can we do? We can learn to hate sin and love sinners at the same time. Paul says in Galatians 6, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." An unwed mother should be able to talk to a New Testament Christian. And a woman who has had an abortion should be able to talk to a New Testament Christian. Chuck Swindoll was right when he said it has come to the time where the most dangerous place to be in America is not in the inner city, where gangs threaten innocent lives, or in angry prisons where only the fit survive, but in the womb of a mother who is being told if she doesn't really want the baby, an abortion is the solution. Thousands of innocent victims are dying every day in this country for the sake of fashion and figures and careers and convenience and selfishness. These victims have no vote, and according to the highest court of our land, they have no legal right. But like Abel, they do have a voice. And the voice of their blood is crying out to God for vindication. The blood of millions of innocent babies is crying out for vindication. And unless this nation repents, God Almighty will answer with judgment. The words of Ezra certainly apply. Ezra 9, verse 6. "And I said, O my God, I am too ashamed and humiliated to lift up my face to you, my God. For our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has grown up to the heavens." Something must be done about this national tragedy. And that means that God's people must do something. David Alsobrook observes, "Either our hands are bloody through direct involvement or indirect silence against this crime, or our hearts are bleeding for the innocent victims who cannot cry out in their own defense. Bloody hands or a bleeding heart, which have you?" I close with the words of the wise man in Proverbs 24, verse 11 and 12. "Deliver those who are drawn toward death, and hold back those stumbling to the slaughter. If you say, 'Surely we did not know this,' does not he who weighs the hearts consider it? He who keeps your soul, does he not know it? And will he not render to each man according to his deeds?" Shall we stand and sing?